Oh, thank you. So we are back now, and we have been talking about the Machiavellian villain as a stock character in Renaissance drama, and I had made the observation at the end of our last segment, but I know we were short of time, so I just want to review that very, very briefly, that Machiavelli, an Italian political theorist and writer, had developed in a work called The Prince, or Il Principe. He had developed a whole concept of how the ruler ought to behave. And for Machiavelli, the two most important things are gaining power and then holding on to power. And that's all really that finally matters for him. And so therefore, morality is dispensable. Morality is dispensable. You can be moral if you want to, but don't let your morality get in the way of holding on to power. Don't have any moral qualms about the kinds of things that you may have to do, even violent acts in some cases, in order to gain or to hold on to power. He says, for example, that if there's political dissent, one of the things you can do is simply grab a couple of the leaders of the rebels and publicly execute them. You don't have to go after everybody. Just go after a couple of the leaders and publicly execute them. And don't have any moral qualms about that. That's simply the way it is in gaining and holding on to power. He does say that you should not interfere with people's private lives in the sense that you should not in any way try to take somebody's spouse from them, nor should you try to take somebody's property from them, because that's when you get yourself into big-time trouble. But other than that, there really don't seem to be any serious moral restraints in Machiavelli. He says, okay, if you want to seem to be a good person and a moral person and a pious religious person, those things are fine. Those things are fine. Just don't get conned into believing that that's what you really should be. So that in our own time, we obviously always have politicians who are wrapping themselves in the flag. I mean, of any party or group, right? They're usually pictured, with a flag behind them, and there may be some patriotic song playing, and here they are pictured maybe in the front of a church, shaking hands with the minister and their family around them. And what are these images supposed to convey? Well, it has very, very little to do with the actual stance that a politician may take, but it has a great deal to do with public imagery. And Machiavelli understood those things. He said, you want to have a good public image if you can, but finally, and this is a direct quote, finally, it is better to be feared than loved. If you can be loved and pull that off, that's fine. But don't get confused and think that people are going to follow you simply because they love you. Ultimately, people will follow you and they will stay in line if they fear you. So that's Machiavelli. And the stock character in Renaissance drama that we know is the Machiavellian villain is the one who will stop at nothing to get power. Okay? Who do you think might qualify in this play to be a Machiavellian villain? Any thoughts?
Evil uncle.
Okay, use your button, please.
Hamlet's uncle. Well, Hamlet's stepfather uncle.
Right, okay, okay. Whose name is? Claudius, right, thank you. His name is Claudius. And so from very early on in the play, we have this sense of him as being, very regal and creating a very strong sense of his presence as the king, and the imagery of Claudius presiding over the court, and there with his queen Gertrude, and all of the pomp and circumstance with which that is usually presented to us in stage and film versions of Hamlet. So, all of those things are very important in terms of appearance. But as we discover, he is really, as Hamlet says, a smiling, damned, smiling villain. Okay? Who will stop at nothing? He not only has murdered his own brother in order to get the throne, but then he has married his sister-in-law, his brother's wife, which was against church laws of the time and was technically considered to be incestuous. And so this is a way simply of his consolidating his power. And then later on, when he discovers that Hamlet may be a threat to him, what does he do? He concocts this whole scheme of using Laertes, the son of the now killed Polonius, to challenge Hamlet to a duel in which he's going to kill Hamlet, right? In other words, Claudius will stop at nothing. He will stop at nothing. And he has no moral qualms whatsoever about exercises of violence, even extreme violence, in order to get power and then to hold on to power. So it's in that sense that he functions as a Machiavellian villain. And we often have such figures in Shakespeare's tragedies, but also in other tragic plays of the time. One thinks, for example, of Iago in Othello, you know, the one who eggs on Othello to believe that his wife is being unfaithful to him, even though she isn't. I mean, we know that she isn't. Othello doesn't want to believe that she's being unfaithful, but Iago keeps egging him on and contriving various kinds of ruses until Othello finally comes to believe that she is unfaithful, and then, of course, he kills her, which, of course, is going to lead to the downfall of Othello. And so Iago appears to be a thoroughly wicked guy, right? So also here with Claudius in Hamlet. Okay, now this raises an interesting point. Last time I was spending a good deal of time talking about Aristotle's Poetics and the influence of Aristotle's Poetics on the construction of plots. And in general, in the 16th and 17th centuries, and especially in the 17th century, and this play was written at the beginning of the 17th century, apparently. We don't know the exact date of its composition, but various kinds of circumstantial evidence suggest a date of around 1600 to 1601. But certainly by the 17th century, and this is something that's going to continue on through the 18th century, there was an extraordinary interest in plotting and in what the French called the well-made play. Now, the French didn't think that the English really made their plays as well as the French did, and they sometimes chided the English for being a little loose in their plot constructions. But nevertheless, we can look at a play like Hamlet, and we can see a great deal of attention paid to plot construction. But starting in the latter part of the 18th century, and then certainly through the 19th century, and on into the 20th and now into the 21st century, we find a shift of interest toward character and the analysis of character and the psychological analysis of character. And two of the first people who do that are the famous German Romantic writer Goethe, best known probably to you all for his Faust, But also the great romantic poet, English romantic poet and literary critic, Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who gave a series of lectures on Shakespeare, one of which was devoted specifically to Hamlet. And those lectures survived because while Coleridge didn't write them down, there were people there who took notes, very careful and elaborate notes on his lectures, and then a modern scholar came along and assembled from those notes the lectures that Coleridge apparently delivered. And Coleridge, and this is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in one way, but not in another, in the second part of this course, which begins with the Romantics, one of the things we spend a lot of time talking about is how the Romantics become very, very, very interested in our interior selves, our feelings, our imaginations, our intuitions, and very interested in psychology and psychological motivation of personality. And so naturally enough, there is an increasing interest in the 19th century, and then on, subsequent to that, in the psychological analysis of characters and of their motives, sometimes perhaps even their unconscious motives. Sigmund Freud, for example, was fascinated with Hamlet. He refers to Hamlet, one scholar says, some 30 times in his writings, sometimes at some length, by the way. He apparently viewed Hamlet as someone who was terribly disturbed with a kind of neurosis which he was never able to cure himself of or shake off or emerge from, and that was ultimately his undoing. And Hamlet, of course, is not really conscious of this, but that's the whole point about Freudian analysis, is that we are the last people who really understand why we feel the way we feel when the source of our feeling is some kind of neurotic problem, that it is necessary psychologically for us to defend ourselves against recognizing as such at a conscious level. And so there are various kinds of theories about repression and suppression and so forth, whereby we are very cleverly, our unconscious personalities are very cleverly able to conceal, not only even from ourselves, but especially from ourselves, what our unconscious motives are. And so Freud apparently was fascinated with Hamlet and saw in Hamlet the unconscious erotic connections between the son and his mother, which of course he termed the Oedipus complex. And he wrote fairly extensively on Oedipus. And in one of his writings at least, he compares Hamlet to Oedipus in terms of what he called the Oedipus complex. And a grossly oversimplified view of this would be what? What is the Oedipus complex? Yeah.
The Oedipus complex is when supposedly the son is still in love with the mother, or the daughter in love with the father is the reverse.
Okay, that's a different version, right? Still in love with, what do you mean by still in love with?
Well, that when they're very small children, all the little children still they're in love with their parents and want to marry them, and that as they grow older, the son comes to hate the father because he's married to the mother, and in that mythology would kill the father to be with the mother.
Yeah, okay. And the love that the son has for the mother is more than just love in our usual sense. It's really erotic. It's really erotic. But of course, we can't face that directly, says Freud. And so what we do unconsciously is we have various psychological mechanisms in our unconscious minds which disguise our real feelings. so that we don't recognize them for what they are. But those feelings may, under certain circumstances, become a problem for us. And that's when, according to Freud, we begin to develop certain kinds of symptoms for which there are unconscious psychological, causal factors. Okay? And then that's what psychoanalysis was designed for, is to try to get at those unconscious factors in order to deal with them in a therapeutic situation where it would be relatively safe to deal with such kinds of conflict, and then to release. There's a kind of catharsis that's supposed to take place in the psychoanalytic experience. So, you know, that's basically the Freudian idea, and one doesn't necessarily have to subscribe to Freud to recognize that that's become a kind of commonplace in our culture. I don't mean literally the Oedipus complex, but the whole notion that there may be unconscious motives and drives and feelings and so forth that have to somehow or another be dealt with. And that's really the goal of various forms of therapy. And that has become such a widespread notion in our culture that it's almost that we take it for granted, or at least most educated people appear to take it for granted. So, in one form or another. Well, let's just say that there's something to that, or at least let's concede that there are people who have believed quite seriously in that kind of psychological theory. Well, naturally enough, sooner or later, somebody's going to start applying that to characters in novels, plays, movies, and so forth, which, as Freud himself said, art is a form of daydreaming. And the key term there is really dreaming. Daydreaming, yes, but dreaming, in which symbolically certain kinds of things may be expressed, not directly, but indirectly, through the symbolism of the story in the dream. And that's one of the reasons why, with real dreams, Freud spent so much time doing analyses of people's dreams, because these are points, supposedly, in which our unconscious minds express themselves in symbols. And then the psychoanalyst is someone who is skilled in learning how to read what those symbols mean. Okay, that's not very far from what we do in the interpretation of art, of painting, of music, certainly literature, certainly drama. We are constantly interpreting symbols and symbolic actions to try to figure out what they mean. It is no accident that Freud was an avid student of literature. And many of his basic ideas, he said, they're already there in the poets. And he didn't mean poets in the narrow sense, but poets in the more general sense of imaginative writers. He said, all my ideas are all right there in the poets. He used to read Shakespeare all the time. He read the classical poets all the time. He read moderns all the time. Okay, and he drew much of his inspiration from his reading of literature. Well, one of Freud's students and early colleagues was a guy named Ernest Jones, who ultimately became the official biographer of Freud. And Ernest Jones wrote a famous book. Well, first of all, it was an essay, and then he developed this into a longer study called Hamlet and Oedipus, in which he developed the theory more explicitly and fully than Freud had. Freud simply refers here and there, almost in passing, to Hamlet. But Ernest Jones actually takes this further, and he analyzes Hamlet's relationship to Gertrude in terms of the Oedipus complex. and then his relationship to his real father, and now, of course, his relationship to his stepfather, who, of course, is also his uncle. And the kinds of conflicts there which ultimately lead to his tragedy. Well, Laurence Olivier, in his version of Hamlet, which some of you may have seen. Have any of you seen Olivier's version of Hamlet, by the way? Okay, one person. It's very interesting. If you get hooked on Hamlet, by the way, you may want to watch more than one version of Hamlet. And Olivier's is now a classic. I mean, some of the things that he does there are, so definitive in a way that every director after Olivier has to decide whether or not he or she is going to direct the play or part of the play the way Olivier did or not. I mean, if you decide not to, you know that you are departing from Olivier. In other words, Olivier has in many ways set the terms. And you can look at subsequent productions, you know, like the ones that I mentioned yesterday. You can look at subsequent productions, you can say, okay, there, you know, he's doing something very much like what Olivier was doing, but over there he's not. So, I mean, that's the importance of Olivier in the history of Shakespearean production. His having been done in 1947 in that classic version. So, Olivier was very taken with that Freudian interpretation, and so much of what he does in his production is to try to bring to life that Freudian interpretation. So, and I touched on that a little bit in our last class, in which I talked about how he has the scenes between Hamlet and Gertrude played in such a way that they are unmistakably erotic. I'm not saying that they're explicitly sexual, but I'm saying that they are unmistakably erotic and erotically charged. So it's also interesting that the woman whom he cast in the role of Gertrude was actually 27 years old when she played that role. Now, Gertrude would have to be a good deal older than that, wouldn't she? I mean, Gertrude would have to be in her late 40s or early 50s, right? And by the way, Olivier himself, Olivier's own real age at that time was 40. So that's very interesting. Here's a 40-year-old man who's playing a younger man. We're going to get to that question in just a moment. And he has a younger woman, a woman who's a good deal younger than he, 13 years younger than he, playing his mother. Well, what's going on there? Well, as some critics have pointed out, that opens the way for a certain eroticizing of the relationship between the two of them in interesting ways. How old is Hamlet? Anybody have an idea? This is a question I always ask in this course. Sorry?
30.
Okay, why would you say he's 30? Okay, you remember that from another class or something you heard? Or
in his 30s. There's no definitive age.
Okay.
There's a quote that says, I'm not so, I have to find it.
Uh-huh. Okay, what evidence would we use? I mean, let's say you're right, you've got a quote that, where he refers to himself as certainly not a child. But often people think of Hamlet as very young. But what does the actual evidence of the play suggest? Anybody have any ideas? Yeah.
Wittenberg, I thought, was a school.
Okay, are you pressing the button? Well, you don't have a button on yours. Okay. Okay, so yeah, Wittenberg is actually a university. And he's been off at the university, right? Okay, so he can't be a kid, if he's a university student. What else do we know? What else do we know that might bear on this in Act 5, Scene 1. The graveyard scene. Remember the graveyard scene? Ophelia now has died. And Hamlet comes upon the funeral that's taking place for Ophelia in the graveyard. But before the funeral procession gets there, he's been talking to the gravedigger. And the gravedigger digs up a skull, sticking away in the grave, you know. And by the way, in the olden days, and in some places this is still done, you know, you might be, when the person died, you know, the person might be buried in a particular grave, but that grave might be reused for somebody else later on. And so the gravedigger is digging away, and he digs up a skull, and he hands it to Hamlet. And Hamlet says, well, who's this? Who's this? And so he says, oh, that's the old court jester. And Hamlet looks at him and he says, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio. Yorick being the name of the guy whose skull has just been dug up. And I can remember, you know, playing with him when I was a little boy. Okay? How long has Yorick been dead? It's been dead some 25 years. Okay? And if Hamlet remembers playing with him, I mean, he can't have been at that time, you know, just 1 or 2 years old. I mean, how many people remember things from when they were 1 or 2 years old when they're adults now? I've actually gone through this exercise sometimes with classes. I won't, you know, entertain you today with that, but you might just think about it. Usually when I ask people to raise their hands, I'll say, how many people remember something from when they're 3 years old? And a couple of people may, and then I say 4 years old, and a couple more people may. But it's usually around 5 or 6 when most of the hands in the room go up. And I know there are some exceptions to that, but most adults remember things from when they're 5 or 6, but have a pretty hazy memory of anything much earlier than that. And so what I'm getting at is you just do the arithmetic. And Hamlet has to be, as you pointed out earlier, he has to be probably around 30, you know, give or take a year, maybe. So he's not a kid. He's clearly, you know, a mature man. And then you say, well, you know, why is he still hanging around the university? Why not? You know, why not? I mean, we have lots of older students in our university. The average age of an undergraduate at the University of Houston is 27. The average age of an undergraduate is 27. And that's not counting the graduate students. Okay? Now, ours, because we're a city university, is probably a little higher than some other colleges and universities. But nevertheless, I mean, there are lots of people who spend much of their lives and careers and so forth around colleges or going back and taking courses. University education at this time was not as formalized and structured as it is now. It was much more a matter of attending lectures, meeting with other people, fellow students as well as faculty members, informally, or in tutorials. And so it was a much more informal kind of process. And people could do it almost at any age, though it's true that the majority were younger rather than older. Okay, so in any event, that gives us some sense of our bearings here. So then that means that, you know, how old is Gertrude? Well, you know, I mean, she has to have been old enough to have had a baby, you know, 30 years earlier, let's say. You know, so she can't have been a child. And, you know, I mean, even if you say that she was a young mother, what, 15, 16, that would still put her in her middle 40s, and very likely older than that, which would put her around 50. or thereabouts. Okay? So she's certainly not an old woman by any means. So it's interesting to see how she is played, how the character of Gertrude is played in different productions. And what you will see often is actresses who are known for their attractiveness will be cast in the role of Gertrude. And if you look at different versions, that certainly has proved to be the case. You want her to be an attractive woman, right? For all sorts of reasons, not because of an Oedipus complex on Hamlet's part necessarily, but because it is very clear that one of the themes in the play is sexuality, and the sexuality and all the sexual energy that exists between her and Claudius, for example, her and her husband. Okay, so notice that what we've been exploring here are certain kinds of questions. Certain kinds of questions. And some of the questions that, that certainly the Romantics were interested in the 19th century and then on into more recent times have been issues like, what about the delay? What about the famous problem of the delay? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? The famous problem of the delay? Hamlet constantly is chiding himself for delaying to achieve his vengeance on Claudius, the killer of his father, Hamlet's father, Hamlet Sr., right? So that in Act 1, Hamlet finds out that Claudius has actually killed his father, right? How does he find that out? Through his father's ghost, right? His father's ghost appears to him and says, you know, look, here's how it all happened. You know, I was taking a nap out in the garden, and he came along and he poured some poison into my ear. And fairly quickly, the poison did its work, you know, and I died. And the notion usually is that the ghost now is in purgatory. Remember we talked about purgatory here before? Is that the ghost is actually in purgatory. He's not been condemned to hell, but he had lived a life which was sufficiently spotty that he has to go to purgatory for a time being. And that seems to be pretty clear from the lines that he speaks in the play. And he there has to purge away his sins. But it was believed that God could allow a spirit to come back from the dead to inform the living of something that the living really, really, really needed to know. Now, what does the ghost tell him? The ghost tells him to exact revenge, right? Now, Hamlet knows. He says, oh, my prophetic soul. All along, I knew that something was wrong. Something was wrong. Okay? But I didn't know quite what it was. Now I know, as a result of the ghost. But what does he do about it? Does he sweep to his revenge? Absolutely not. And in a number of the soliloquies, he's chiding himself, he's lashing himself for his inaction. Why isn't he taking decisive action and go after Claudius, kill Claudius? I mean, you know, killing the king is a huge deal, and it would be taking on a huge responsibility. But apparently, he could have proved his case to the satisfaction of the others around him in the court. So why doesn't he? He keeps saying to himself, over and over and over and over and over again, oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I, et cetera, et cetera. The famous to be or not to be speech, in which he's even considering committing suicide. He's so depressed, not simply over what has happened, but over his own inability to act. Right? So there's the famous question of the delay. Why does Hamlet keep delaying and delaying and delaying and delaying until it's too late? And by the time he actually tries to take decisive action, he's already fatally wounded himself. That's in Act 5, Scene 2. So, what are we dealing with here? The famous problem of the delay. What would argue against that? Because there are some literary critics who have said, Hamlet doesn't really delay. Where have people come up with this notion of Hamlet and the problem of the delay? What would the counter-argument be? Anybody have any ideas? Yeah.
I got the impression that it was more like he wanted to make sure, like that he wasn't completely sure that the ghost was, a heavenly apparition or something that was being truthful with him, because of the whole deal with the play, with the actors wanting to see Claudius's reaction. That's kind of the way I took it.
Okay, okay. Or if not a heavenly apparition, far worse, a demonic or diabolical apparition, because it was believed at that time that the devil had the power to assume different shapes in order to tempt people to commit sin. Let's see, did you also have your hand on the button there?
Well, I was going to say partly that, but partly he's obviously very disturbed about what has happened, you know what I mean? It shakes him up. He's not really sure. Half of him is a little crazy, half of him is a little sane, and that's kind of the whole play right there, is him wading through his madness to figure out what he's going to do about it.
Okay, okay. Now that raises another question we're going to have to come back to, which is he really mad or not? I mean, mad being the Renaissance word. That's the word, of course, that's used in the play. Is he really or is he not? And we'll have to look at that in more detail. Yeah. Do you have a... Oh, you don't have one? Oh, okay.
Did he want to protect his mom from moral pain?
That's an interesting question, too. That's a very interesting point, because look at the pain that would have caused her. That's true. I don't know if that got out on the soundtrack, so let me just repeat your question, which was, as I understand it, that he may very well not have wanted to cause more pain to his mother, and that would be good enough reason for him to hesitate to kill, after all, her brand new husband, right? Whom she seems to be hanging on. I mean, she seems really to be in love with him and very attracted to him. And what if all of a sudden her son came in and butchered her husband, her new husband? Well, wouldn't that be a pickle, as the old saying goes? What are we dealing with here in terms of a delay? Well, let's go back to this question of the ghost. If it was believed at the time that the devil could assume a shape like this to try to tempt people to commit some terrible sin, well, how do you know how reliable this ghost is? What if somebody came into the room right now? I mean, surely nobody would come late to class, but let's just assume that somebody comes into the room right now and is very, very distraught, and interrupts the class and says, I had a dream. Well, I don't know if it was a dream or not, but a ghost appeared in my bedroom last night and told me to assassinate the President of the United States. Well, presumably, you know, what we would do is we would try to hold that person down, you know, until the proper authorities could get here and cart the person away, right? I mean, we're talking about something really crazy. You know, to assassinate the head of state. That's what the ghost is asking Hamlet to do. Well, there's a whole political dimension to that too, isn't there? So there's very good reason for Hamlet to want some kind of evidence that would corroborate what the ghost has told him. And so what does he use as a test? The play within the play, as it's generally called. The play within the play. And that's the function of the play within the play. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. And so he tells the players, right? He tells the players, if I give you a few lines to add to your performance of the murder of Gonzago, you know, can you memorize them and put them in? Oh yeah, oh sure, we can do that. And so they actually act out a scene which is identical to what the ghost told Hamlet that Claudius had done to him, Hamlet Sr., in killing him. And of course Claudius reacts violently and clearly with a guilty conscience. And so Hamlet says, aha, aha. But then he has an opportunity to kill Claudius, doesn't he? What is that opportunity? Two scenes later. Sorry?
I'm sorry. It's when he's, doesn't he go to confess his sins or something, or goes to confessional of some type?
Yes, Claudius goes to the chapel. And he's not going to confession in the sense of going to a priest, but he is praying. He's kneeling, praying in this chapel. And he's calling on God and God's angels and so forth to help him. Because apparently he is so struck with a sense of his own guilt that has just been exposed, right? And Hamlet comes in. Claudius doesn't see him come in, but Hamlet comes in. And Hamlet says, ah, I could do it now. I could do it right now. And after all, he's got a sword. You know, I could kill him right now. Why doesn't he kill him?
So he doesn't want him to go to heaven after confessing his sins.
Right, right. Right, right. What kind of revenge does he want then? Sorry?
I said the cold kind. I was just joking.
Well, the revenge he wants is he wants to send him to hell. He wants to catch him not at prayer, asking for God's forgiveness for his sin. He wants to catch Claudius when Claudius is committing some sinful act, kill him then so that he will go straight to hell. And that is true revenge. So a lot of people who are proponents of the delay interpretation will say, he should have killed him. He should have killed him. The people who argue against the delay will say, but there was very good reason, Hamlet felt, for not killing Claudius at that point. So Hamlet himself, however, in his soliloquies, keeps chiding himself for his inaction. What's a soliloquy? Let's go to the tablet. I'm going to write that on here. Let's see. We got... I think that's, no, it doesn't have an E, does it? Whoops. I believe that's right. Okay. One of my daughters one time pointed out to me, the only time I misspell words is when I'm writing them on a blackboard, and this is, of course, is the electronic version of a blackboard for all practical purposes here. There must be some strange psychological reason for that, which I don't want to go into by any means. But a soliloquy is what? Yeah.
Is it when the actor is on stage by himself and he'll only say all his thoughts, but it's always a true thought, like, you know, his true thoughts, he'll never lie during that time?
Okay, okay. So that the person is talking aloud to himself or herself. Anything else about that? Do you ever talk to yourself? You just don't answer, she says. Well, I don't know. I mean, I talk to myself. Some of my most interesting conversations are with myself. But you're absolutely right. And what is the dramatic function of a soliloquy? I mean, you're writing a play now, and why would you have somebody give a soliloquy?
Well, it lets you inside that character's head.
Right, right. How else are you going to know what's going on in the person's mind? In movies, we have other ways of doing it, don't we? I'm thinking of a particular movie right now where the camera starts moving in. This is in a kind of tracking shot. Moves in on the face of this man. And then the cinematographer lets the image go out of focus. And we hear a voiceover of this guy's voice, but it's a little lower in timbre. And then there's a cut, and the next thing we see is him somewhere else. We are now inside his head, right? According to the grammar of film, we are inside his head, and this is what he is remembering. Okay? So, and there are other ways that we can do that in film. But you obviously can't do that sort of thing, what I just described, in a play that's taking place on a stage right in front of us. So the soliloquy becomes the dramatist's solution to the problem, how do we let the audience know what somebody is thinking? What his interior thoughts are, okay? And of course, as you pointed out, generally speaking, the person is not going to be lying to himself. I mean, it's true that people can lie to themselves, but generally speaking, that's not what happens in soliloquies. So, in his soliloquies, what is he doing? He's lashing out at himself for his inaction. He's not trying to excuse or justify his inaction so much as he's furious with himself. Though he does ultimately try to justify his inaction. So we get to the end of the play. And when he does take action to kill Claudius, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, he's already fatally wounded. So that he's going to die within a very short period of time. So we'll get to talking about some of these scenes in more detail as we go along. But consider the other question, which is obviously related, that you brought up just a moment ago, and that is his madness. And again, madness, I mean, we don't use that term in the same sense that Shakespeare and his contemporaries did. I mean, we may say, oh, I'm mad at so-and-so, but we don't really mean I'm crazy with anger. But that's generally speaking what they meant by madness. Okay, so is he or is he not? Well, what does he say to Horatio and the other guards after the meeting with the ghost at the tail end of Act 1. What does he say? Has anybody been watching the play? What does he say at the end of Act 1? He makes them, first of all, he makes them swear that they're not going to reveal any of this, right? Why would he do that? Why would he care? Yeah.
No one would believe him.
No one would believe him, that's probably true, but also Claudius would find out what Hamlet now knows, right? And what would Claudius do? Claudius would not hesitate to kill Hamlet or have Hamlet killed. Doesn't he try to have Hamlet killed? I'm not talking about in Act 5, but before that, how? Well, go ahead.
He sends him away with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and they have a letter to England so that the King of England will have him killed once he gets there.
Right. That's correct. And so clearly, Claudius doesn't scruple to use any means necessary, not only to gain power, but also to hold on to power. Remember what we said about the Machiavellian villain earlier on. So if Claudius were to find out that the ghost has told Hamlet that Claudius is guilty of assassinating the former king, his own brother, so it's not only the assassination of the king, but it's fratricide, right? The killing of one's brother, which is a terrible, terrible, terrible crime, and from the church's point of view, a terrible, terrible, terrible sin. So, Claudius is not going to let anybody live very long who's going around saying that sort of thing. So, he makes Horatio and the others up there on guard duty swear that they know nothing of what has happened. About the appearances of the ghost of the old Hamlet, or any of that, okay? And then what does he say? If you afterward see me, what? Anybody remember? You know, if you see me acting strangely after this, that I may put antic disposition on. Antic, have you ever heard that word? It used to mean something like crazy. Okay, doesn't really quite mean that anymore. I had a teacher who used to tell me to stop my antics in class, but you know, so we use it in a much milder sense now. But what is Hamlet saying? He's saying, don't pay attention. If afterward I seem to be acting in a kind of crazy way, right? He's planning something. He is planning to act in a kind of crazy way so that nobody will pay attention to him. So nobody will take him seriously. Oh, that's just crazy old Hamlet. Okay? But let's question the question after we take our break.